There is a photograph, if you go looking for it, of a fighter parked on wet concrete at an airfield in Cambridgeshire in the spring of 1942. It does not look like much. The nose is too long. The wing is thin and strange. There is a scoop hanging under the belly that looks like somebody bolted it on as an afterthought and forgot to tidy it up. Every man who walked past it that April had spent the last 3 years of his life around hurricanes and Spitfires, and this thing looked wrong to all of them. It had come off a ship. It had crossed the Atlantic in a wooden crate stamped with the address of a factory in California that none of them could have found on a map. And the official verdict, written up in careful Air Ministry language and filed away where the men who mattered could read it, was that the aeroplane was a disappointment. That is the part I want you to hold on to, because it is the part that makes everything that follows so strange. When the first Royal Air Force pilots climbed out of the American Mustang and were asked what they thought of it, they did not say what the paperwork said. They said something the paperwork had no room for. And one of them, a 32-year-old test pilot, who had flown almost every fighter Britain owned, climbed down off that wet concrete after half an hour in the air and said, in effect, that he had just flown the finest airframe in the world and that the only thing wrong with it was the engine. He was right. And the story of how he came to be right, and of what the men who flew this machine actually said when they got their hands on it, is one of the quietest and most consequential episodes of the entire air war. So let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment Britain went looking for an aeroplane and got handed something nobody had asked for. In the spring of 1940, the Royal Air Force was losing fighters faster than the factories at home could build them. France was days from collapse. The men doing the buying knew, in the cold arithmetic of an air force at war, that they could not close the gap on British production alone. So they sent people to America to find aeroplanes. Any aeroplanes. Sir Henry Self ran the aircraft side of the British Purchasing Commission out of New York, and his job was to walk into American factories and come out with fighters that could survive over Europe, and to do it in months. The trouble was that American fighters in 1940 were not built for the war. Britain was fighting. There was the Curtiss P-40, which was a decent enough machine down low, but ran out of breath long before it reached the heights where German fighters liked to work. There was the Bell Era Cobra, an odd design with the engine behind the pilot that did even worse up high. And there was the Lockheed Lightning, twin-engined and promising, but nowhere near ready. That was the shelf Self had to shop from. When he asked Curtiss to build more P-40s, they told him their lines were already full. There was no give anywhere in the American aircraft industry, and the clock was running. Then a man named James Kindleberger changed the whole shape of the thing. Everybody called him Dutch. He ran North American Aviation, and when Self came to him and asked whether North American would build P-40s under license, Dutch told him no. Not because he could not do it, because he thought he could do better. He told Self that his people could design an entirely new fighter from a blank sheet faster than they could tool up to copy somebody else's. And then he put a number on it that should have sounded absurd. 120 days from signing the contract to a flying prototype. Self thought about it, and he said yes. Now there is a detail here that most tellings skip, and it matters, because it tells you something about how thin the margins were. The British insisted that North American buy the wind tunnel data from a Curtiss project called the XP-46, so that no American testing effort would be wasted duplicating work. North American paid Curtiss $56,000 for it. And when the engineers finally sat down with all that data, they took one look and concluded that almost none of it was any use to them, because the aeroplane they had in their heads was not the conventional machine Curtiss had been drawing. It was something new. So they set the paperwork aside and started fresh. The man who led that design was Edgar Schmued, a German-born American who had come over as a young man and worked his way up through the small aircraft firms of the 20s and 30s until he was running the preliminary design office. He was quiet, exact, the kind of engineer who drew like a draftsman because he had been one. His team was small, and they worked the kind of hours that ruin a man's home life. One of them remembered afterward that the only night they went home at a decent hour was Sunday, and even then, not before 6 in the evening. The airframe rolled out of the shop 102 days after the contract was signed. 102. And it did not even have an engine in it yet because the engine was late. When the Allison finally arrived, its mountings did not match the airframe, so they built new ones. And in the autumn of 1940, a freelance test pilot took the prototype up off the field at Mines Field in Los Angeles, the ground that is now the Los Angeles airport, for a first hop that lasted 5 minutes. He came back down, and later the same day he went up again for 10. Over the flights that followed, he came down every time more impressed than the last. The British gave the aeroplane its name in a contract amendment that December. They called it the Mustang. And here is where the disappointment starts, because it is a disappointment built into the machine from the beginning, and it has one specific cause. The engine was an Allison V1710, a 12-cylinder American power plant, and it was a perfectly honest engine as far as it went. But it had a single-stage, single-speed supercharger, which is the part of the engine that crams air in as you climb and the air gets thin. And it had that supercharger for a reason that had nothing to do with the airplane. The United States War Department was hoarding its turbo superchargers for 4-engined bombers and would not release the good ones for a fighter being sent abroad. So the Mustang got the modest one. And the result was an airplane that was superb up to about 15,000 feet and then simply gave up. At 20,000 feet, the best it could manage was around 357 miles an hour, which was slower than the Spitfire Mark V and slower than the German Messerschmitt it would have to fight. It took 11 minutes to claw its way up to 20,000 feet. The Spitfire did the same climb in 7. For the war being fought over occupied Europe, where the killing happened high up, that was fatal. Fighter Command took one look at the numbers and did not want the aeroplane. So the Mustangs went instead to Army Cooperation Command, which was the polite name for the outfit that did the low, unglamorous work. Reconnaissance runs, photographs, shooting up things on the ground. The first squadron to get them, number 26 at Gatwick, handed back their old Tomahawks and took on Mustangs and flew their first operation in May of 1942, when a pilot took off and shot up a goods train on the French coast. Britain had gone to America looking for an aeroplane to win a war, and what it had put into service was an aeroplane to strafe trains. That is not my judgment. That is what the record says, and for a while the record looked like the whole story. Except it wasn't. And the men who flew it low knew it wasn't, long before anyone in an office worked it out. Because down where these Mustangs were forced to operate, the pilots were seeing something that did not fit the file. This aeroplane was fast. Not fast for a hand-me-down. Fast in a way that made no sense next to the Spitfire they had been raised on. At 5,000 feet, a Mustang was 30 miles an hour quicker than a Spitfire Mark V. At 15,000, it was 35 miles an hour quicker. And it was doing that while carrying a less powerful engine than the Spitfire had. The pilots could feel it in the seat of their trousers. Something about this airframe was slipping through the air in a way that nothing else did. They did not have the language for it, most of them, but they knew what they were feeling, and what they were feeling was that the aeroplane was better than they had been told. What none of them could see from the cockpit was why. And the why is genuinely remarkable, because Schmued's team had built into that machine 3 separate ideas that between them put it years ahead of everything else in the sky. The first was the wing. The Mustang was the first fighter in the world to fly with what is called a laminar flow wing, a shape worked out with the American research body that would one day become NASA. Put plainly, the air stayed smooth and attached to the wing far longer than it would on an ordinary one, which meant far less drag at speed. The second was the shape of the fuselage itself, which had been drawn using mathematical curves called conic sections, one of the very first aeroplanes ever lofted that way, and the result was a body so clean the air seemed almost reluctant to notice it was there. And the third was that scoop under the belly that everyone thought looked so ugly. That radiator duct, by a piece of luck that shaded into genius, actually gave a little push back. The hot air leaving the radiator produced a small amount of thrust of its own. The ugliest part of the airplane was quietly helping to drive it forward, and on top of all that, the Mustang carried far more fuel than a Spitfire, nearly 180 American gallons in the wings against the Spitfire's 100 Imperial gallons or so, which was a detail that meant nothing to Army Cooperation Command in 1942 and would mean absolutely everything 2 years later, though nobody knew that yet. So there it was. The most advanced fighter airframe in the world, strafing lorries in northern France, wasted because it had the wrong engine bolted to the front of it, and nobody with the authority to fix it had bothered to look past the altitude figures. Enter the man who looked. At the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, there was a wing commander named Ian Campbell Ord who ran the place, and one of his Mustangs had come in for high-altitude trials. Campbell Ord read the test reports as they came in, and he saw exactly what everyone else saw. Poor above 18,000 feet. But Campbell Ord had been a fighter pilot himself, and he had a feel for aeroplanes that a man reading numbers off a page does not always have. He watched this Mustang in the air, and what he watched did not match the verdict in the file. He could not put it into words either, but he trusted the discrepancy enough to do something about it. He picked up the telephone, and he rang Rolls-Royce at Hucknall, and he asked them to send him their best man. Their best man was Ronnie Harker. Harker was 32. He had been flying for Rolls-Royce since the early 30s, and for the last 3 years his job had been one of the more interesting jobs in British aviation. He was the man the company sent out to Royal Air Force squadrons to fly their new aeroplanes and work out whether a Rolls-Royce engine might make them better. He had flown the Hurricane and the Spitfire, the Whirlwind, the Tornado, most of the front line. He had, by any measure, one of the broadest catalogs of fighter feel in the country, and he had a quiet, unshowy way of describing what an aeroplane did that made people trust him. On the 30th of April, 1942, he arrived at Duxford, and Campbell Ord walked him out across the dispersal to where the Mustang sat, and told him to take it up and tell him honestly what he found. I want to slow down here, because this is the half hour the whole story turns on, and it deserves to be felt rather than summarized. Harker climbs into a cockpit that is arranged all wrong for a British pilot. The harness sits differently. The instruments are not where his hands go looking for them, and the throttle, maddeningly, moves the opposite way to what he has spent a decade training his muscles to expect, so that his instinct to pull back for power will actually cut it, and he has to consciously override his own hands. He starts the Allison. It fires up, workmanlike, unremarkable, the very engine that has been the source of every complaint anyone has ever filed about this machine. He taxis out. He lines up. He pushes the throttle the wrong way for a British pilot, which is to say forward, and he goes. And in the 30 minutes that follow, Ronnie Harker feels the thing that no report had been able to tell him. He feels how the aeroplane answers. He feels the speed down low that has no business being there. He feels an airframe that is honest and quick and beautifully balanced, an airframe that does what he asks the instant he asks it, and he understands, up there over Cambridgeshire, that he is not sitting in a second-rate fighter with a good turn of speed. He is sitting in the best fighter airframe he has ever flown, and it is being strangled by an engine that runs out of air 2/3 of the way up. He came back down. He sat with Campbell Ord for a long time and said very little, which the people who knew Harker recognized as the thing he did when he was thinking hard. And then he drove back to Hucknall, and the next morning, the 1st of May, 1942, he sat at his desk and wrote a report. Now, if you are expecting the report to read like the moment history turned, you will be disappointed, and I think that is the most human thing about it. There is no thunder in it. Harker wrote it the way a professional writes up a flight. He set out what the aeroplane did well. He set out what it did badly. And then, in plain technical language, he wrote the sentence that mattered. He said the Mustang looked to him like a formidable fighter down low and in the middle heights, and that if you put a proper engine in it, specifically the new Rolls-Royce Merlin-61 that was being got ready for the coming Spitfire Mark 9, the performance could be, in his word, outstanding. He noted, on the strength of his own flying, that the Mustang was 35 miles an hour faster than the Spitfire Mark 5 on roughly the same power. He got one thing wrong, and I mention it only because it is a nice reminder that the men who make history are not gods. He wrote that the aeroplane had been designed by a former Messerschmitt engineer. It hadn't. Edgar Schmued had never worked for Messerschmitt in his life, had never set foot in a German fighter design office. Harker was simply repeating something he had picked up somewhere. The mistake changed nothing. What changed everything was the recommendation, and the thing Harker did next. Because here is the part that separates Harker from every other clever man who had a good idea during the war and watched it die in a drawer. Before he had even finished writing, he had already picked up the telephone. He rang a man named Ray Dory, who ran the experimental flight test side at Hucknall, and he asked him a very simple, very concrete question. How fast could Rolls-Royce get a Merlin-61 into a Mustang? That question moved. Within 48 hours, Dory had taken it to Ernest Hives, who ran Rolls-Royce, and Hives had taken it to Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who was then Vice Chief of the Air Staff and one of the few men in Britain with the weight to make something like this actually happen. By the 13th of May, less than a fortnight after Harker's half-hour flight, there had been an Air Ministry meeting and the conversion had been authorized. 5 Mustang airframes were to go to Hucknall to have Merlins fitted. For the sake of secrecy, the whole thing was given a name that gave nothing away. Mustang X. Think about what actually happened there. A test pilot with no authority to order anything, writing an internal company memo, had, in under 2 weeks, set in motion a project that would change the air war. He had no rank to throw around. What he had was the willingness to make a phone call before the ink was dry, and the good sense to make it to the right person. His report, people love to point out, did not contain a single original idea. Others had already thought the Mustang wanted a better engine. That is true. But thinking it is not the same as doing it, and Harker did it. He was the spark that jumped the gap. He was the thing that turned a scattered pile of good instincts into an actual aeroplane. Without him, the pieces stay on the shelf. With him, they came together. Now, I want to pause on why this so nearly didn't happen. Because the resistance was real, and it was reasonable. The Merlin was the single most precious thing British industry made during the whole war. Every Merlin that came off the line already had a name on it. A Spitfire, a Lancaster, a Mosquito, a Beaufighter. There was no spare capacity, none, and there was a very good argument that taking Merlins meant for the Spitfire Mark IX, the very aeroplane Britain was rushing into service to deal with the terrifying new Focke-Wulf 190 and handing them to an American experiment, was close to madness. It looked like robbing your own front door to gamble on somebody else's aeroplane. The Air Ministry's first instinct was to say no, and I honestly cannot say they were wrong to hesitate. 2 things beat that hesitation. The first was Wilfrid Freeman, who was exactly the kind of senior official the whole system depended on and rarely admitted it depended on. He was the man who had pushed the Mosquito through against the same sort of resistance, and some serious historians will tell you he was the most consequential British air official of the entire war, precisely because he was willing to be personally, publicly wrong. He put his weight behind the Mustang. The second thing was an American. A military attaché in London named Thomas Hitchcock heard what the British were up to and understood instantly what it might mean for his own country's bombers, and he sent word home. It reached the top of the United States Army Air Forces, and suddenly a British project to put a British engine in an American airframe had American sponsors, which meant it could no longer be quietly killed. Between Freeman's nerve and Hitchcock's letters, the thing stayed alive. The work started at Hucknall in June of 1942. And the men doing it worked as though the war depended on it, even while the Air Ministry above them was still fretting about the diverted engines. The Rolls-Royce engineers ran the sums and concluded, on paper, that a Merlin Mustang ought to reach around 440 miles an hour high up. That was a shocking number. It was faster than the Spitfire Mark IX by a good margin, with vastly more range. But numbers on paper have never flown a mission. Somebody had to build the thing and take it up. They fitted the first conversions, and they made 100 small choices as they went, almost none of them dramatic. all of them necessary. They used a Merlin close to the one going into the Spitfire Mark 9, so that they could compare like with like. They swapped the three-bladed propeller for a four-bladed one, because the two-stage Merlin made so much more power that the old propeller could not turn it all into thrust. They added a second radiator under the chin, because the new supercharger ran hotter than the Allison ever had, and the old belly scoop could not shed the heat on its own. Every one of those decisions was made by an engineer under deadline, often without waiting for anyone to sign it off, on the quiet understanding that if the aeroplane came good, the paperwork could catch up afterward. That is how real breakthroughs happen in wartime, by the way, not handed down from the top in a finished plan. Assembled in the middle, in cold drawing offices at 3 in the morning, and blessed after the fact by the men whose names end up in the history books. The first Mustang X took off in October of 1942 with a Rolls-Royce test pilot at the controls, and the results were, frankly, hard to believe. Within a month, one of the conversions was doing 433 miles an hour high up. Another climbed to an absolute ceiling of over 40,000 feet, an altitude no Allison Mustang had ever dreamed of reaching. The one thing this aeroplane had been mocked for, its performance up high, was now better than the Spitfires. It got to 20,000 feet in roughly half the time it used to need. The Mustang, with a Merlin in the nose, was now the fastest piston-engined fighter in the world. Faster than anything the Germans had. Faster than anything the Americans had. Faster, by a measurable margin, than the very Spitfire whose engine it was now sharing. And the pilots who flew the converted machines came down, speaking in the same odd, restrained way Harker had spoken back in April. Not whooping. Something quieter and stranger than that. The way people talk when they have just been shown something they were not prepared for, and the ordinary words feel too small. The official test reports out of Hucknall and out of Boscombe Down used the dry, careful language such reports always use. But the figures underneath the language were shouting. Here, though, the British ran into a wall that had nothing to do with the aeroplane, and everything to do with arithmetic. They could not build these things in the numbers that mattered. Rolls-Royce's Merlin lines were already flat out. Even after the conversion proved everything Harker had claimed, only 25 Mustang X's were ever built in Britain. 25. The breakthrough Harker had spotted and Campbell Ord had backed and Freeman had shoved through the Air Ministry was going to have to be built somewhere else, by somebody else, on a scale Britain simply did not have. And that somewhere turned out to be a car factory in Detroit. Packard, the American company that had made luxury motor cars for wealthy Americans before the war, had been licensed to build the Merlin in the United States since 1940. The American-built Merlin was already coming off the lines. And North American, tipped off through Hitchcock's reports about what the British were doing, had already quietly started its own Merlin Mustang in parallel over the summer of 1942. In late November, just a month after the British prototype flew, a North American test pilot named Robert Chilton took the first American Merlin Mustang up off the field in Los Angeles. And Chilton, on that first flight, did not bother with the gentle, careful, low-speed handling checks a test pilot usually works through. He just pointed the nose at the sky and climbed. At 20,000 feet, the supercharger changed gear on its own, and the Merlin kept pulling. He went through 30,000, higher than any Mustang had ever been, and the aeroplane was still going up strongly underneath him. His notes from that day are not grand. They are the clipped shorthand of a working pilot. But the numbers in them are extraordinary. The aeroplane topped 441 miles an hour high up, more than 100 miles an hour faster than the Allison Mustang at the same height, and its climb had roughly doubled at every altitude. The Americans had ordered 400 of them on the strength of the projections alone, before a single Merlin Mustang had even flown. After Chilton's flight, they raised the order to 2,200. By 1944, the aeroplane was pouring out of two plants, one in California and one in Texas, at a rate no British factory could have come close to matching. The idea was British. The airframe was American. The engine was British, built in America. And the sheer weight of it, the numbers, the thing that let it actually change the war rather than just win an argument, That was pure American industry. No one nation made the Mustang. That is the truth that runs underneath the whole story, and I will come back to it. But first, the thing your title actually promises. What did the men who flew it say? The Royal Air Force got the Merlin Mustang, which it called the Mustang Mark III, at the end of 1943, and the pilots who converted onto it from Spitfires left some of the most honest testimony in the whole literature of air fighting. And what strikes me about it is how little it sounds like sales talk, and how much it sounds like men describing a friend they have learned to trust. The word they kept reaching for was honest. That was the British compliment, and it was not a small one. When a Royal Air Force fighter pilot called an airplane honest, he meant that it did not lie to you. It did not have a nasty surprise waiting at the edge of the envelope, a wing that would drop without warning, or a stall that would kill you before you understood you were in trouble. The Mustang, they said, told you what it was about to do before it did it. You could ride it through maneuvers they swore the Spitfire would not have survived, and when you came out the far side, the aeroplane would still be there underneath you, steady, waiting for the next thing you asked of it. Coming from men who loved the Spitfire the way the British loved the Spitfire, that was close to heresy, and they said it anyway, because it was true. There was a trade in it, and the honest pilots admitted the trade. The Spitfire could outturn the Mustang. In a tight, low knife fight of a turn, the Spitfire was the better dancer, and any Spitfire man who moved to Mustangs felt the difference and missed it. But the Mustang gave you something the Spitfire never could, and it gave it to you in an amount that was almost embarrassing. It gave you range. It gave you the ability to still be there, hours later, hundreds of miles from home, with fuel in the tanks and fight left in the aeroplane. And in the war that was coming in 1944, that mattered more than the turn. The Americans put it more bluntly, because Americans usually do, and their words are worth borrowing because they were flying the same machine the Royal Air Force men flew. One American ace, asked what made the Merlin Mustang the airplane to take bombers deep into Germany, gave an answer that has been quoted ever since. He said it had the three qualities you needed for the job: range, range, and range. Another of the high-scoring American Mustang pilots wrote in his memoirs that the airplane simply went, and I will keep his word, like hell, because the Merlin had, again his words, great gobs of power, and it was equally happy high or low thanks to that clever two-speed supercharger that shifted gear for you as you climbed. These were not men writing brochures. These were men who had bet their lives on the airplane over hostile territory and lived to write it down. And to understand why range became the whole ballgame, you have to understand what was happening to the bombers, because it was a slaughter. The American daylight bombing campaign over Germany was built on a beautiful, deadly idea. The idea was that the big four-engine bombers, the flying fortresses and the liberators, bristling with machine guns and flying in tight defensive boxes, could fight their own way to a target deep inside Germany and back without needing fighters to hold their hands. On paper, it worked. In the air over Germany, it did not. The German fighters took the bombers apart. On one raid in August of 1943, against the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt and the aircraft plants at Regensburg, the Americans sent 376 bombers and lost 60 of them shot out of the sky, roughly one aeroplane in 6, gone in an afternoon. 2 months later, they went back to Schweinfurt on a day the crews would forever call Black Thursday, sent nearly 300 bombers, lost 60 more in the air, and wrote off another 17 that limped home too broken to fly again. When you do the sum, close to one airplane in 4 did not come back in any useful condition. No Air Force in history had ever been able to take losses like that and keep going, and the Americans could not either. The bombers needed escorts, and no fighter in service had the legs to go all the way. The Thunderbolt could not do it. The Lightning could not do it reliably. The Spitfire, that superb short-range interceptor, ran dry long before Germany. The bombers would fly out with a fighter escort. The escort would reach the limit of its fuel somewhere over the border and turn for home, and the moment it turned, the German fighters, who had been circling and waiting, fell on the bombers and butchered them the rest of the way to the target and all the way back. The Merlin Mustang was the aeroplane that closed that gap. With drop tanks slung under the wings, it could go to Berlin, fight over Berlin, and come home. With an extra tank fitted behind the pilot and bigger drop tanks under the wings, its useful reach pushed past 800 miles. For the first time in the war, the bombers could be escorted all the way to the deepest target in Germany, and all the way back, and the German fighters, who had grown used to a free hunt once the short-legged escorts turned around, suddenly found American fighters waiting for them over their own cities. And then a general did something that turned the Mustang from a shield into a sword. In January of 1944, James Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force, and one of the first things he did was walk into the office of his fighter chief and ask what the sign on the wall said. The sign said the job of the fighters was to bring the bombers home. Doolittle told him to take it down. The new job of the fighters, he said, was to destroy the German Air Force. That one change of orders let the Mustangs off the leash. They no longer had to fly tied to the bomber boxes like nervous sheepdogs. They could range ahead and around and behind, hunt the German fighters wherever they found them, chase them down to their own airfields, and catch them taking off and landing. And the German fighter arm, already bleeding, began to die in numbers it could not replace. In the 4 months from January to April of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost something like 1,000 single-engined fighter pilots, killed, missing, wounded. The training pipeline could not fill a hole that size. The best of them died faster than the schools could make new ones, and the new ones died faster still. There is a line that gets repeated in every documentary, that when Hermann Göring saw American fighters over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. You should know that nobody has ever found those exact words in the surviving records, and it is best treated as a paraphrase rather than a quote. But the substance of it is true, and it comes from a better source. Adolf Galland, who commanded the German fighter arm, told his American interrogators after the war, flatly, that the arrival of the long-range escort was the decisive turning point of the whole air war over Germany. He was in a position to know. He had watched it happen to his own men. Before I go on, I want to hand a moment back to the men who were actually there, because there are a couple of episodes from the low, unglamorous Allison days that history has almost buried, and they deserve better. In August of 1942, over the disastrous raid on the French port of Dieppe, the Allison Mustangs were flying reconnaissance above the beaches while the landing force below was being torn apart. It was a bad day, one of the worst, and the Mustang squadrons took losses. But in the smoke over Dieppe, an American flying with the Royal Canadian Air Force, a young man named Hollis Hills, who had joined the Canadians before his own country was even in the war, fired on a Focke-Wulf 190 and watched it go down. It was the first enemy aircraft ever credited to a Mustang in air-to-air combat. Hills had no idea that morning that he was opening a chapter that would end 3 years later with Mustangs shooting up aircraft on the runways outside Berlin. He was just a young pilot in an aeroplane he had been told was second-rate, doing the thing in front of him, and a couple of months later, in October of 1942, 4 Mustangs crossed the German border. Allison Mustangs, the supposed disappointments, flying low under the German radar, the first single-engined fighters based in Britain ever to reach German soil. The Germans, when they worked out what had happened, were genuinely rattled, because they had assumed that no single-engined fighter out of England could reach their territory at all. The Mustang had just quietly proved them wrong, and it had done it before anyone changed the engine. The seed of the whole long-range fighter idea, the thing that would eventually break the Luftwaffe, was already sitting inside that airframe. The Merlin did not invent it. The Merlin took something that was already there and multiplied it. So why was it Harker? Why him and not one of the dozens of experienced men who flew this airplane before he did? The honest answer is that it was not only him, and the popular version that makes him a lone genius is both wrong and a little unfair to everyone else. Plenty of people had seen pieces of it. The squadron pilots knew the Allison Mustang was a marvel down low. The engineers at North American knew perfectly well the airframe was ahead of its time. Even inside the American Air Force, someone had already floated the idea of a better engine. The thought was not rare. What was rare was doing something with it inside 48 hours. Harker's gift was not seeing what nobody could see. His gift was refusing to let what he saw sit and go cold. He flew the airplane, he understood it, and before he had even finished the report, he was on the telephone to the one man who could start turning the idea into hardware. He did not have a new idea. He had an old idea and enough urgency to shove it past the friction that kills good ideas every single day. That is a rarer thing than genius, and it is the thing that actually moves the world. It is also why the official histories tend to undersell him. He was not a senior officer. He wrote no grand doctrine. He flew a borrowed aeroplane for half an hour and typed up a short report. That is not the sort of thing that gets a man a statue. He got a modest honor late in his career. He retired to New Zealand and spent his last years fishing and flying. He took his final flight in a Mustang in New Zealand in 1997, at the age of 88, and by every account he went to his grave content, not feeling overlooked in the slightest. He was not the sort of man who needed his name painted on the airplane, and Thomas Hitchcock, the American attaché whose letters kept the project alive, paid a far higher price and is remembered even less. Before the war, he had been the finest polo player in the world, a man with access at the very top of American society, and he had used that access to make sure Washington understood what the British had stumbled onto. But he never saw the airplane vindicated in combat. In April of 1944, he was flying one of the early Merlin Mustangs near Salisbury, testing the very handling problem the extra rear fuel tank had introduced, a dive to explore how the airplane behaved with that tank full, when it broke apart in the air. He was 44. The Mustang owed him a debt that both air forces quietly acknowledged at the time, and that the histories have mostly forgotten. I keep coming back to the strangeness at the heart of all this, which is that the Mustang was nobody's aeroplane and everybody's. The airframe was American, drawn by a German-born immigrant and his exhausted little team in California. The engine was British, from Derby. The wing was a joint effort between an American company and an American government laboratory. The production engines were built in Detroit by a firm that had made luxury cars. The early British conversions used British propellers, the American ones used American propellers, and the drop tanks that gave the airplane its whole reason for existing were an Anglo-American thing. There is no single national hero in this story, and no single national villain either. There is a long chain of men in two countries, most of whom never met, each of whom added one small thing, and the sum of those small things was the finest piston fighter of the war. Two industrial nations, working in parallel and hardly ever in step, more or less accidentally built the airplane together, because each of them happened to have exactly the thing the other one lacked, and none of them set out to build a war winner. That is the last thing, and to me, it is the most striking thing. The British in 1940 did not ask North American for a legend. They asked for a stopgap, an aeroplane to fill the gap until home production caught up. Something to be getting on with. The Mustang was designed to be available, not immortal. The fact that it became the machine that broke the German dayfighter force and carried the bombing campaign into the heart of Germany and back is the kind of accident no committee could ever have planned. It happened because Schmued and his team, by instinct or luck, drew the right airframe. It happened because Rolls-Royce, working on an engine for an entirely different aeroplane, happened to build the right engine. And it happened because a 32-year-old man on loan from Rolls-Royce was handed a borrowed American fighter on a wet Cambridgeshire morning and chose, in the 30 minutes he had, to trust what the aeroplane actually told him rather than what the file said it was. So what did the Royal Air Force pilots say when they first flew the American Mustang? Down low, in the disappointing days, they said it was faster than it had any right to be, and they could not explain why. In the cockpit of the Merlin machine, they said it was honest, that it told you the truth, that it would carry you through things the Spitfire could not survive and still be there when you came out the far side. And one of them, on the 1st of May in 1942, said the most important thing anyone said about it, in the plainest possible words, with no thunder in his voice at all. He said it was a formidable fighter that deserved a better engine, and he knew exactly which one. And then he picked up the telephone and made the call that made it real. The history of the air war is full of moments like that. One person, in one room, on one ordinary afternoon, making a decision everyone afterward has had to live with. Most of those people are not famous. Most of them died as quietly as they lived. They flew and they wrote and they argued and they pushed an idea through, and then they went home and made tea and read the paper and never once told the story as though they had been important. But they were important. The names on the museum aeroplanes belong to the manufacturers and the squadrons, not to the test pilots and the engineers who sat up recalculating supercharger gears at 3 in the morning in cold offices on both sides of the Atlantic. Remembering them, by name where the records keep the names, and by simple acknowledgement where they do not, is about the only thing we can still do for them. So that is what this is, a small piece of that remembering.